great hall of Ashvale had not been so full in 40 years. Every seat along the carved obsidian galleries was occupied, every standing space along the walls claimed by bodies pressed shoulder to shoulder, every breath held in collective anticipation, as the torches burned their deep amber along the stone columns, and the ceremonial banners of the 5 noble packs stirred in the draughts that moved through the high vaulted ceiling, like something alive and restless. The mate recognition ceremony was the oldest ritual in the kingdom, older than the current monarchy, older than the borders that defined Ashvale as a single nation, rather than a collection of warring territories, and it had not been performed for a ruling Alpha King in 2 decades. The court had waited for this night, with the particular hunger of people who understand that what they witness will be written into the histories, that their grandchildren will ask them where they stood and what they saw, and most of them had already composed in their minds the elegant versions of themselves they intended to present to posterity. Kyle Dravenmore stood at the center of the ritual circle, and he looked like every painting that had ever been made of his ancestors. He was tall in the way that alpha bloodlines produce tallness, not merely height, but density, the kind of physical presence that made the air around a person feel more substantial, more pressurized, as though the space itself understood that something significant occupied it. His ceremonial armor was black with silver detailing. The wolf crest of House Dravenmore raised on his chest in hammered silver that had been in the family for 6 generations, and his dark hair was worn back in the formal style required for ritual occasions, exposing the strong line of his jaw and the controlled neutrality of his expression that the court had learned to read as his default state of authority. He had ruled for 11 years. He had ended 2 border conflicts without open war. He had reformed the trade agreements that had been strangling the eastern territories for decades. He was considered, by general consensus among the nobility and the common packs alike, to be the finest Alpha King Ashvale had produced in a century, and he carried that assessment with the quiet confidence of someone who had worked very hard to deserve it. He had not expected this. That was the truth he would carry with him for a very long time, the thing he would return to in the silent hours when the rest of the palace slept, and he sat alone with the weight of what he had done. He had not expected her to be the one the bond chose. He had understood, in an abstract and comfortable way, that the mate recognition ceremony might produce a surprise, that the ancient magic that governed mate bonds did not consult political convenience or dynastic strategy before making its selections. But he had allowed himself to believe, in the way that powerful people allow themselves to believe things that make their lives simpler, that the bond would choose someone appropriate, someone from the noble lines, someone whose presence at his side would require no explanation, no negotiation, no managing of the court's expectations about what a queen should look like and where she should have come from. Sarah Voss walked into the ritual circle from the eastern archway, and the hall went very quiet, in a way that was different from the anticipatory quiet of before. A quieter quiet, a quiet with texture and implication, the silence of several hundred people simultaneously recalibrating something they had assumed was settled. She was the kingdom's senior Omega healer, a title that sounded more significant than the court had ever chosen to treat it. A woman who had spent 15 years in the service corridors and the healing wards and the quiet, unglamorous rooms where the work that nobody wanted to acknowledge got done. She was not plain, but she was the kind of beautiful that the court consistently failed to see because it did not announce itself, because it lived in the steadiness of dark eyes and the particular quality of stillness she carried and the way her hands moved when she worked, which was a thing you had to be paying a specific kind of attention to notice. Her ceremonial robe was the soft gray of the Healers' Guild, not the jeweled silks of the noble houses, and she wore no jewelry except the small amber pendant that had been her mother's, and she walked into the center of the ritual circle with the same quiet purpose she brought to everything, which was to say, she walked in as though the work in front of her mattered, and the watching did not. The bond recognition happened the way it always happened in the stories, which is to say, it happened all at once and without warning, and with a completeness that left no room for interpretation. The ritual torches flared gold simultaneously, all 12 of them, a thing that was supposed to happen only when a true mate bond was confirmed in both directions. The warmth that moved through the circle was visible, not as light exactly, but as a shimmer, a distortion of the air between Cale and Sarah. And every wolf in the hall felt it in their own chests like a sympathetic vibration, like a bell being struck somewhere inside them. The ceremony master, Elder Brennan, who had officiated at more mate recognitions than anyone living, went still with an expression that was very close to awe. Cale looked at Sarah Voss, and he felt the bond snap into place in the part of him that predated language and reason, and 11 years of carefully cultivated political authority. His wolf, the ancient bloodline power that ran through the Dravenmore line like a river underground, recognized her with a certainty so absolute it was almost violent, a recognition that moved through his entire body and settled in his chest as something he had no frame of reference for, because he had never felt it before and had not understood until this moment that he had been waiting for it. She was his mate. The bond was real, and it was true, and it was the oldest and most irrevocable thing in the world of wolves. He looked at her standing in her gray robe with her steady eyes, and he looked at his court watching with their 400 collective opinions already forming, and he made the worst decision of his reign in under 4 seconds. "I deny the bond," he said. The words landed in the them. Silence like stones dropped into still water, the ripples moving outward through the hall in the form of held breath and widened eyes, and the particular tension that comes when something has happened that cannot be unhappened. Elder Brennan's face went through several expressions very quickly. The court erupted in the careful, muted way that courts erupt, the sound of it more like a disturbed nest than an explosion. Murmurs and gasps, and the rustling of people turning to one another to confirm that they had heard what they thought they had heard. Sarah Voss did not flinch. That was the thing. That was the thing that Cale would not be able to stop thinking about in the days that followed. Not her expression of hurt, or her anger, or her tears, because she showed him none of those things. She looked at him with the steadiness that was apparently just her nature, the way she looked at everything, and something in her eyes settled into a kind of resolution that he did not have the vocabulary to name in that moment, though he would learn its name later. She turned to Elder Brennan and inclined her head in a small, precise gesture of acknowledgement that managed somehow to carry more dignity than anything else that had happened in the ritual circle that evening. And then she turned and walked back through the eastern archway, and the gray of her robe disappeared into the corridor, and the hall exhaled. The ceremony continued. It had to. There were protocols. Cale stood in the ritual circle and completed the formal declarations required of a ruling alpha who had denied a recognition, the ancient words that were supposed to sever the bond cleanly, and he said them with the voice he used for state addresses, clear and authoritative and entirely controlled, and the court watched him with the particular attention of people who are storing information they believe they will use. He was aware, in the part of him that had learned to track political temperatures the way other people track weather, that he had not managed this well. He had managed it decisively, which was different. Decisiveness and good management were not the same thing, and he knew it even then, in the moment. But he was also very aware of the 400 pairs of eyes watching him, and the histories being written in 400 separate minds, and the question of what it would mean for Ashvale to have an alpha king, whose mate was a woman who served in the healing wards, who had no pack lineage worth noting, who wore gray and amber, and who was, by every metric his court used to measure significance, nobody at all. He told himself it was a decision made for the kingdom. He believed it, to the extent that powerful people believe the justifications they construct for the things they want to do anyway. His wolf said nothing, in the way that something very old and very certain says nothing when it has decided to wait. If you're finding this story as gripping as we do, this is a perfect moment to hit that like button and subscribe so you never miss a story from this channel. The best part is still ahead, and you are going to want to be here for it. The blood moon ceremony began 3 hours after the mate recognition, as it always did, as the old calendar demanded. It was a separate ritual, older even than the mate recognition, a ceremony of the wolf itself, rather than of the pack or the court. a time when the barriers between the conscious mind and the animal nature thinned to near. Transparency and the bloodline power of every wolf in the kingdom surged toward the surface of the skin. For most wolves it was manageable, a heightening of senses, a pull toward movement and wildness that could be channeled through the formal ceremonial dances and the ritual hunts in the palace grounds. For the Alpha King, the blood moon was something considerably more demanding. The Dravenmore bloodline carried something that the scholars called the primordial seal. It was not a wolf in the ordinary sense. It was something older than the word wolf, something that had run through the original founders of Ashvale before the territories had names. A power of such magnitude that every Dravenmore king for 6 generations had maintained the seal through daily ritual and discipline and the careful management of emotional states that might create cracks in the containment. Cale's father had told him when Cale was 12 years old that the primordial within the Dravenmore line was not a beast to be mastered. It was a sovereign in its own right, with its own judgments and its own allegiances. And the only thing that kept the relationship between king and primordial functional was mutual respect and honest dealing. Cale had taken this advice, and then spent 11 years believing that discipline and authority were sufficient substitutes for both. He was about to learn otherwise. The blood moon ceremony was held in the great courtyard, open to the sky. The full moon, a blood red, that the old texts described as the moon wearing its oldest face. The face it showed when the world was young, and the wolves ran at the borders of everything, and nothing had been settled yet. The court assembled in their formal positions around the courtyard's edge. The ceremonial fires burned at the 4 compass points. Cale stood at the center again, as he had stood in the ritual circle 3 hours before, and the moon's light hit him like a physical weight, and the primordial inside him, which had been completely silent and perfectly still since the moment he said the words, "I deny the bond," woke up. It did not wake up gently. He felt it move through him, the way a tide moves through a harbor. Not violently, but with absolute authority, with the certainty of something that has been very patient and has now decided that patience has served its purpose. The control he maintained over his bloodline power was not fragile. He had spent years ensuring it was not fragile. But what rose in him now did not push against his control so much as it simply moved past it, the way the ocean moves past the things built on its shores when it has decided to come in. His senses expanded to a radius of 300 meters in an instant. He could feel every wolf in the courtyard, their heartbeats, their breath, the particular signature of their individual energies. And beneath all of that, at the edge of his expanded perception, he could feel a heartbeat he recognized, with a completeness that bypassed every rational process he had. Sarah Voss was in the healing ward on the eastern wing of the palace, which was within the perimeter of the courtyard ceremony, which meant she was within the range of a primordial wolf's extended senses during a blood moon, which was something nobody had apparently considered when they assigned her to her evening duties, or perhaps something nobody had thought to consider because nobody had expected the primordial seal to break during a blood moon, which was in turn because nobody had expected the Alpha King to deny a confirmed mate bond 3 hours before a blood moon, which was the kind of cascading consequence that the court's 400 collective intelligences had not modeled when they watched Cale make his declaration. He held on. That needed to be said, because it was true, and because it took everything he had. For approximately 11 minutes, while the blood moon ceremony proceeded around him and the court maintained their formal positions and the ceremonial fires burned at the 4 compass points, Cale Dravenmore held the primordial seal through an act of will that cost him more than anything he had ever done in his life. 11 minutes during which every rational argument he had made to himself about dynastic responsibility and political optics and the management of expectations held against the oldest force in his bloodline. 11 minutes during which he stood at the center of his court and performed the ceremony and kept his face completely neutral and felt the primordial pulling at every seam in his containment like something testing the integrity of a wall. On the 12th minute, Sarah Voss, 140 meters away in the healing ward, dropped a glass instrument while treating a patient, and the sound of it shattering reached him with perfect clarity through his expanded senses. and he heard her small sound of frustration at herself, and the primordial simply decided that 11 minutes was enough. What happened next was not a shift. Kale did not transform. The Dravenmoor primordial did not work the way ordinary wolf bloodline power worked, which was perhaps the most important thing the court had never fully understood about what they were dealing with. It moved through the king's body while he remained in his king's body, expressing itself not as a separate form, but as an intensification of everything he already was, his eyes going to the deep amber gold of the ancient bloodline. Instead of his normal dark, his presence expanding outward in a wave that every wolf in the courtyard felt simultaneously in their own chests as a pressure and a pull, as the wolf equivalent of being in a room when a very loud and very low note is struck, felt more in the ribs than in the ears. He moved. The court would describe it afterward in various ways, depending on their position in the courtyard and the particular angle of their witnessing. But the consistent elements across all accounts were these. The Alpha King moved through the ceremonial assembly without touching a single person, a path opening ahead of him with the automatic deference of wolves responding to something older than hierarchy, older than the ranking systems the packs had built, something that predated the concept of a court entirely. He moved through the eastern passage into the palace, through the servant corridors that he knew because he had walked every corridor in this palace as part of his preparation for rulership, through the route to the healing ward with the efficiency of someone moving along a line that had been drawn before he was born. Sarah looked up when he came through the door, and the patient she had been treating made a small sound and went very still, in the particular way that lower-ranking wolves went still in the presence of something overwhelming, an instinct that had nothing to do with thought and everything to do with the body's older wisdom. She was holding a replacement instrument, her hands steady despite everything, and she looked at Kale with his amber gold eyes and his expression that was no longer the controlled neutral of the king and was instead something rawer and older and more honest, and she did not step back. She met his gaze directly, which was either extraordinary courage or the particular steadiness that seemed to be simply her nature expressing itself even in extraordinary circumstances. And she said quietly, "Your Majesty, you need to stop." The primordial looked at her through Kale's eyes and said, with Kale's voice but a resonance in it that made the walls of the healing ward vibrate very slightly, "No." It crossed the room in 3 steps, and it raised Kale's hand and it pressed its palm to the side of her neck, and the mark came from somewhere beneath the skin, gold light tracing the pattern of the ancient claiming bond along her throat and collarbone and the curve of her shoulder. Not burning. The accounts would later agree that it did not appear to burn, but leaving behind a pattern as permanent and as indelible as anything in the world of wolves, the primordial mark, which had not appeared on anyone in Ashvale in 200 years, which the scholars had believed was lost with the old bloodlines, which was by every authority on wolf law and wolf magic the most binding and most irrevocable form of claiming that existed. And then the primordial receded, because its business was done. Kale stood in the healing ward with his hand against Sarah Voss's neck, and his own eyes back in his own head, and the mark glowing softly on her skin. And the patient in the bed was staring at both of them, and the silence in the room was the loudest thing he had ever heard. "I did say stop," Sarah said, and her voice was perfectly calm, and that was somehow the most undoing thing that had happened in an evening that had been full of undoing things. He became aware, in stages, of the sound of movement in the corridor outside. The court. They had followed, of course they had followed, because the court always followed when something significant moved through the palace with that kind of energy and intention. Because witnessing was what courts did. Because 400 people had been positioned to see whatever happened this evening, and the evening had not finished happening. Through the open doorway, he could see the faces of the ceremony master, and 3 members of the High Council, and at least 24 nobles who had made excellent time through the ceremonial corridors, and all of them were looking at the mark on Sarah Voss's neck, with expressions that ranged from astonishment to calculation, to something that was, in several cases, very close to awe. He had denied the bond in front of the entire court 3 hours ago. His wolf had marked her in front of the entire court's witnesses now. The contradiction was complete, and it was public, and it was, by every law that governed the Pax of Ashvale, irresolvable. In his favor. Make sure you share this story with someone you know who loves a good supernatural romance, because this next part is where everything really begins to shift, and you are not going to want to face it alone. Sarah Voss slept in the healer's suite that night, which was a room she had occupied for 11 years, and which was, by the standards of the palace, extremely functional and not particularly comfortable. And she lay on the narrow bed and looked at the ceiling and let herself feel, privately and completely, and without the steadiness she had performed for the court, every part of what had happened. The denial had hurt. She would not pretend otherwise, not to herself in the dark, not in the accounting she was trying to be honest about. She had known when she walked into the ritual circle what the ceremony was. She had known in the abstract way that everyone in Ashvale knew, that the mate bond was real and could be recognized, and that the recognition was not a choice. She had not expected it to be her. She was 32 years old, and she had spent those years in healing wards and archive rooms and the quiet places where the unglamorous necessary work of keeping a kingdom healthy got done. And she had been very comfortable with the understanding that her life was going to be full and purposeful and not particularly visible. The mate bond had not been part of her plan. The Alpha King looking at her in front of the entire court and saying, "I deny the bond," had not been part of any plan she could have imagined, but it had also, in some fundamental way, not surprised her. Because the court's assessment of what mattered and who mattered had never included her, and she had a long time ago made peace with that. What she had not made peace with, and could not lie in the dark and pretend she had made peace with, was the mark. She raised her hand and touched the pattern on her neck and collarbone, the gold lines that had cooled now to something that was more felt than seen in the dark, a warmth that ran along the mark like a slow current, like the bond itself had found a physical channel and was moving through it. She had read about the primordial mark. The archives in the Healers Guild contained the old texts, the ones that predated the current noble house system, the records from when Ashvale was still assembling itself into a coherent kingdom, and the Dravenmore primordial was a known and documented fact of the world rather than a historical. Footnote: she had read those texts because she read everything, because that was her nature, because the work of being a truly skilled healer required understanding things that were not strictly medical, because the history of wolf biology and wolf magic and the bloodlines that carried unusual properties was directly relevant to her practice. She knew what the primordial mark meant. It was not the same as a regular mate mark. A regular mate mark, even a confirmed one, could be complicated by denial, could exist in a legally ambiguous space when one party rejected the bond, could become the subject of council deliberations and legal proceedings, and the kind of institutional negotiation that the pack courts had developed specifically for exactly these situations. The primordial mark was different. The old texts were very clear. It was not a claiming in the political sense. It was a recognition in the metaphysical sense, an acknowledgement by the oldest power in the Dravenmore line that this person was necessary to its continued function, that without the bond completed, the seal would become unstable, that the primordial had made its position known in the most permanent language available to it. The king had denied the bond. The primordial had marked her anyway. And now Sarah Voss, senior Omega healer, nobody of particular consequence by the court's accounting, was lying on her narrow bed with the most binding magical claim in the history of Ashvale written on her skin, and the Alpha King was presumably somewhere in the palace trying to reconcile 11 years of good governance with the worst decision of his reign. She was not, she decided, going to make it easy for him. That was the resolution she had been working toward since the moment in the ritual circle, when she had looked at him and seen him choose pride over truth. She had not asked for the bond. She had not asked for the mark. But she was here now, in this situation that had been created entirely by a sequence of decisions in which she had had no agency whatsoever, and she was going to handle it the way she handled everything, which was to do the work in front of her with her full attention and her complete competence, and absolutely no performance of smallness for the comfort of people who preferred not to see her clearly. She was also going to open the old archive texts in the morning and document every relevant precedent with the precision she brought to her medical records. Because if there was going to be a legal and institutional reckoning with what had happened in this palace tonight, and there was going to be, she was going to walk into it with better preparation than anyone in that courtroom expected from a woman in a gray robe. In the morning, Cale called for her. She went, because she was choosing to go, and she understood the difference. The king's study was not the throne room or the council chamber, or any of the formal spaces the palace offered for official communications. It was a room that he apparently actually worked in, which Sarah noted as a data point, the kind of room where a person spent real time rather than performed authority, shelves of actual use rather than display, papers with the characteristic disorder of ongoing work rather than ceremonial arrangement, a desk with the scuffed edge of something that had been useful for many years. He was standing at the window when she was shown in, and he turned when she entered, and he had the look of someone who had not slept and knew that this was apparent, and had decided that performing otherwise would be insulting given the circumstances. "Healer Voss," he said. "Your Majesty," she said. There was a pause in which both of them apparently took stock of the situation they were in, which was the situation of two people who had shared the most significant supernatural event in the kingdom's recent history, and who were, by every legal and metaphysical framework available, bound to one another in a way that one of them had publicly rejected and the other had not asked for. "I owe you an apology," he said, and the words had the quality of something he had arrived at through actual thought rather than political calculation, which she registered as another data point. "You do," she agreed. She did not add anything to this. She did not accept the apology, or decline it, or make it easier or harder. She simply confirmed that he was correct about the debt, and let that sit in the room between them. He looked at her with an expression she was learning to read, which was different from the controlled neutral of the public king. Something more uncertain and considerably more honest. "I made a decision last night based on factors that had nothing to do with you, and everything to do with what I believed I needed the court to see. I was wrong, and the consequences of that wrongness have fallen primarily on you, and I am aware that saying so does not change what happened." "No," Sarah said. "It doesn't. But it does suggest that you understand the situation clearly, which is a better starting position than several alternatives." She paused, and then continued, because she had made her decisions in the night, and she was going to follow them through. "I spent 4 hours this morning in the archive room. I have a complete documentation of every legal precedent related to primordial mark situations. There are 6 in the recorded history of Ashvale. And in 4 of those 6 cases, the outcome was determined by how the council chose to interpret the authority of the primordial seal relative to the authority of a ruling alpha's public declaration. In 2 of those 4 cases, the interpretation was made in the context of significant political pressure from noble houses who had preferred candidates. I expect you know which cases I'm referring to." He was looking at her differently now, and she recognized the quality of the shift. It was the look of someone recalibrating an assumption. "You've read the Kessler records," he said. "I've read everything in the archive that pertains to primordial bloodline events," she said. "I was assigned as the palace's reference healer for bloodline medical matters 6 years ago. The reading was relevant to my work. I've simply never had occasion to apply it in quite this direction before." He was quiet for a moment, and then he said something she had not expected. "I need you to tell me what you found. And I need your honest assessment of the legal situation, not the one that's favorable to my position." She looked at him steadily. "That may not be a comfortable request when you hear the answer." "I'm aware," he said. "I'm asking anyway." This was the moment, Sarah understood, when the actual work began. Not the ceremony, not the mark, not the public drama of the denial and its consequences, but this. 2 people in a room with a complicated situation between them and a question of whether they were going to address it honestly or manage it politically. She chose honest because she had not become a healer by telling patients comfortable untruths. She sat down because a 4-hour discussion of precedent law required a chair, and she told him everything she had found. Don't go anywhere, because the next part of this story is where Cale begins to understand exactly who he denied, and it is absolutely worth staying for. Drop a comment below telling us what you thought of Sarah's response in that study, because we read every single one. The legal situation was, in Sarah's precise and extensively documented assessment, not good for Cale's original position, and not particularly simple for either of them. The primordial mark was irrevocable. This was not a matter of council interpretation or noble house preference. It was a metaphysical fact documented consistently across every text in the archive that addressed the Dravenmore bloodline's unusual properties. The mark existed outside the jurisdiction of pack law in this same way that weather existed outside the jurisdiction of pack law. It was simply a condition of the world that law would then have to accommodate. What the council could debate was not the mark itself, but its implications for governance, for the question of Sarah's status, for the management of the Alpha King's earlier public denial, and for the question of what the primordial seal's instability would mean for the kingdom if the bond remained formally uncompleted. This last point was the one that Sarah delivered with the particular precision of someone presenting a medical diagnosis, which was essentially what it was. The primordial seal, according to the oldest Dravenmore records and the biological texts she had reviewed, was not a static magical construct. It was a living system, sustained by the bloodline's power and the psychological integration of the wolf who carried it. And it had been designed, if designed was the right word for something that had evolved over centuries, around the assumption that a primordial-bearing king would complete his mate bond, and thereby have an anchor, a stabilizing center, a point of return when the ancient power rose to the surface. The denial of the bond had created an instability in the seal. The blood moon had amplified it. What had happened the previous evening was the primordial expressing that instability in the most direct way available to it, which was to handle its unfinished business directly and without asking permission. If the bond remained formally uncompleted, the pattern of escalating instability would continue. This was not speculation. This was documented in the records of the one historical case where a primordial-bearing king had attempted to refuse a mate recognition. The king in question had died within 3 years, not from the primordial directly, but from the cumulative cost of trying to contain a power that was working against his decisions rather than with them. His kingdom had very nearly collapsed with him. Cale listened to all of this with the attention of someone who was actually listening rather than waiting for his turn to speak, and when she finished he was quiet for long enough that she could hear the wind against the study windows. And then he said, "You're telling me that the situation is medically dangerous." "I'm telling you that the situation is medically dangerous," she confirmed. "I'm also telling you that the council needs to hear this from a documented source, rather than from rumor and court gossip, and that the framing of this conversation matters significantly for how the institutions of Ashvale respond to it. Right now, the narrative in the court is that the Alpha King denied a bond, and then his wolf acted against his stated will. That narrative is damaging to your authority in one direction. The alternative narrative, that the primordial recognized a mate with sound medical and strategic reasoning that was not immediately apparent, is better for the kingdom, but requires your willingness to revise a public statement. You're asking me to admit I was wrong," he said. "I'm asking you to consider whether being correctly wrong is a better position than being incorrectly right," she said. "The primordial didn't mark me because it was feeling contrary. It marked me because the bond is real and the instability in the seal is real, and the historical record is very clear about what happens when a primordial king refuses a true mate bond. The court denied the same history for the same reason courts always deny inconvenient history, which is that it complicated the immediate preference. I'm not inclined to let that choice be made again." He looked at her for a long time. She let him look, because she had learned that the useful thing to do when someone needed time to arrive at the truth was to not interrupt the journey. "I need to understand something," he said finally. "You are sitting in my study, telling me the medical case for completing a bond that I publicly rejected, and that you have every right to refuse. Why? Because the health of the seal is the health of Ashvale's alpha line," she said. and I am Ashvale's senior Omega healer. And that is my responsibility, whether or not the bond is completed. The documentation work and the council case need to be made regardless of what you and I decide to do about the personal dimensions of this situation. I would be failing in my professional responsibilities if I did not make them. She paused. And because you asked for my honest assessment. That is not a small thing in my experience. I have spent 15 years in this palace presenting honest assessments to people who wanted comfortable ones. And most of them chose the comfort. You asked for the honest version. That matters to me. He was doing the recalibration thing again, the subtle shift in how he was looking at her. She found, to her own mild surprise, that she did not dislike being seen that way. It was different from the court's method of looking at her, which was to look through. The council convenes in 3 days, he said. I will need a complete formal documentation of the precedents and the medical assessment of the seal. I will also need... He paused, and something crossed his face that was not the controlled neutral of the king, but something considerably more human, some guidance on how to do this correctly. I have managed the court's opinion for 11 years. I have not managed a situation where my own actions require the management. That is a remarkably honest thing to admit, Sarah said. I'm operating on the assumption that honesty is the functional approach at this point, he said, given that the alternatives have not served me particularly well in the last 12 hours. They haven't, she agreed. But they could have served you worse. You could have doubled down this morning. You didn't. That's worth something. She stood, because there was work to do, and she had always been better at work than at anything that required sitting still. I'll have the documentation ready by tomorrow evening. You should also speak with Elder Brennan before the council meeting. He was the ceremony master at the Corvin case 60 years ago, which is the most relevant precedent, and his first-hand understanding of how that situation was managed is going to be more useful than my reading of the records. You've already identified the witnesses I need to speak to, he said. It was not quite a question. I identified them at about 3 a.m, she said. I find I work well when I'm trying not to think about something else. She left the study with the sense that something had begun that was very different from the way things began in the stories about mate bonds and alpha kings. And she was not sure yet whether different was good or simply complicated. But she was a healer, and healers dealt with complicated. And so she went to the archive, and she opened the records, and she did the work. We'll be right back to this story. But if you're not yet subscribed to this channel, please do it right now, because stories like this one are what we live for, and we want to make sure you're here for every single one. Now, let's find out what happens at that council meeting. The council chamber of Ashvale was built to intimidate, which was the honest architectural purpose behind its high obsidian walls and its raised council dais and the arrangement of seating, that put the ruling alpha at the chamber's focal point and everyone else in graduated positions of decreasing proximity to power. Sarah had been in this room twice in 15 years, once to testify in a matter related to a healing dispute between 2 noble houses, and once to present the annual report of the Healers Guild, which the council had listened to with the specific courteous inattention of people performing due diligence on a subject they had already decided was not interesting. She had worn gray both times, as was appropriate to her guild and her rank, and she wore gray now, though the mark on her neck was visible above the collar of her robe, and the gold of it against her skin was doing more for the room's attention than any formal insignia she could have worn. Kyle had prepared. She could see it in the way he carried himself into the chamber, which was not the performance of authority he had given at the mate recognition ceremony, but something more deliberate, more grounded. The posture of someone who had made a decision and was going to stand in it without hedging. He had also, she noted, positioned her chair at the council table rather than in the witness area, which was a statement before anyone had spoken a word, because the witness area was where people gave testimony and then left, and the council table was where people stayed, and the distinction was not lost on any of the 12 council members who were watching the room with the alert precision of people, whose profession was reading exactly these kinds of signals. Elder Brennan opened the session with the formal language, and then Cale spoke first, which was his prerogative as Alpha King, and which he used with the efficiency of someone who had decided that brevity was the more authoritative choice. 3 days ago, I made a public statement that I now understand was factually incorrect, he said, into a chamber that had gone so quiet the candle's movement was audible. I denied a bond recognition, based on factors that were insufficient justification for the denial. The primordial seal's response to that denial was documented by multiple witnesses and is not in dispute. I am asking the council today to consider the full situation, which Healer Voss will present, and to advise on the appropriate path forward, beginning from the position that the bond is real, the mark is permanent, and Ashvale's Alpha King made an error that requires correction rather than management. The silence that followed this had a different quality from the silence at the mate recognition ceremony. This was the silence of 12 very experienced political minds, simultaneously encountering something they had not expected from an Alpha King, and trying to determine what it meant and what their response to it should be. Lord Cassius Viel, the High Council's eldest member, and the one most likely to be the source of opposition, was looking at Cale with an expression that Sarah could not quite read from her. Position. Something between skepticism and a kind of reluctant reassessment. Sarah opened her documentation. She had learned, over 15 years of presenting medical information to people who would rather not hear it, that the most important quality of a presentation was not comprehensiveness, but clarity of sequence. That what people needed to understand was not every fact, but the facts in the right order, so that each one built on the last, and the conclusion felt inevitable rather than argued. 4. She presented the precedents first, not because they were the most important element, but because they established that she was speaking from documented history rather than from personal interest. And she presented them in the voice she used for medical consultations, which was the voice of someone who had all the relevant information and was sharing it as a professional service rather than making a case. The Corvin precedent was the centerpiece. 60 years ago, in a situation with significant structural similarities to the present one, a ruling Dravenmore Alpha had experienced primordial instability following a disrupted mate bond recognition. The instability had progressed over 18 months in ways that had been documented by the court healers of the time. And Elder Brennan, who sat at the far end of the council table with his hands folded and his expression of someone watching a well-prepared student demonstrate mastery, confirmed her reading of the records with small nods that the room could see. She then presented the medical assessment of the current seal instability. She was precise, and she was thorough, and she was entirely neutral in her delivery, because neutrality was the most persuasive tone available when the facts themselves were doing the arguing. The physiological markers she had observed in Cale's behavior during the blood moon were consistent with the documented early stages of seal deterioration. The timeline, if the situation remained unresolved, was not encouraging. The solution was documented, and it was straightforward, and it was sitting at the council table in a gray robe, presenting the relevant evidence. Lord Cassius Vale said, when she had finished, "Healer Voss, you are presenting a case that benefits you personally." "I am presenting a case that is documented in the archives," Sarah said. "The benefit to me personally is incidental to the medical and legal facts. I would direct the council to examine whether the records I have cited are accurate, which they are, rather than examining my motivations for presenting them, which are professional. If it would ease the council's mind, I am prepared to state for the record that I did not seek this bond, did not anticipate this outcome, and would not have chosen a process that involved public humiliation as its initial stage, none of which changes the documented facts." Lord Cassius Vial looked at her for a moment, with an expression she was now able to identify, because she had seen it before, twice, in the cases of patients who had come to her, expecting her to tell them something other than the truth, and who had found, upon receiving the truth, that they were not as unready for it as they had feared. He nodded once and said, "Proceed." The council deliberated for 2 hours. Sarah sat at the table through the deliberation, because Cale had positioned her chair there, and she had decided to occupy it fully, and she answered questions when asked with the Same precision and neutrality she had brought to the presentation, and she watched Cale manage the council with the skill she had observed him use in other contexts, the skill of someone who knew how to bring people toward a conclusion without making them feel led, who understood that authority worked better as gravity than as instruction. The formal resolution that emerged from the deliberation was not everything she might have wanted, because formal resolutions in council chambers never were. But it was enough. The Alpha King's public denial was formally revised in the council record to reflect the documented facts of the primordial seal situation. Sarah Voss's status was adjusted to reflect the primordial mark, a status designation that had not existed in the administrative records for 200 years, and which required 3 council members and Elder Brennan to research the appropriate historical precedent for its form. The bond completion process was placed on a formal timeline that allowed both parties a structured period of deliberation and agreement, which was Sarah's specific contribution to the deliberation, because she had no intention of allowing the process to move at anyone's pace but her own. And in the formal record, under the signatures of 12 council members and the ceremony master and the Alpha King, Sarah Voss was recorded as the mate of the Alpha King of Ashvale, and the recording was in the gold ink, reserved for declarations of permanent consequence. She walked out of the council chamber into the corridor with the documentation under her arm and the mark warm on her neck, and something that was not quite satisfaction and not quite relief, but was perhaps the feeling of having done a difficult job with her full competence, and Kyle fell into step beside her in the corridor, and they walked for a moment in the particular silence of 2 people who have just done something significant together and are deciding what to say about it. "You were remarkable in there," he said. "I was prepared," she said. "Which is not the same thing, but it's the part I have control over." "It is the same thing," he said, "when the person doing the preparing is you." She glanced at him sidelong, and he was looking at the corridor ahead of them, with an expression that was, she was learning. His honest face rather than his king's face, the one he apparently wore when he was saying things he meant rather than things he had considered. She filed this observation with the others she had been collecting. "I owe you more than an apology," he said. "I understand that. I am not going to pretend that the council resolution is the end of the accounting, because it isn't." "No," she agreed. "It isn't. But it's the beginning of a working relationship, and I find I'm better with beginnings than I expected to be." He stopped walking, and because she was paying attention, she stopped walking too, and they stood in the corridor outside the council chamber, with the formal record still fresh and the mark on her neck and the 3 days of this impossible situation between them. And he looked at her with the honest face and said, "Why did you trust me with the real assessment? In the study, you didn't know I wouldn't use it against you." She considered this carefully, because it deserved care. "I didn't trust you," she said. "I trusted the primordial's judgment, which is not the same thing, but it's a place to start." He absorbed this, and then something shifted in his expression that was entirely new, something she didn't have a category for yet. And he said, "Then I will try to deserve the primordial's confidence." "You could try to deserve mine," she said. "That would also be acceptable." The corner of his mouth moved in a way that was not quite a smile, but was clearly the precursor to one, and she thought that this was interesting, this face, and that she was going to pay attention to it. Comment below, and tell us who you think had the best moment in this chapter, because we genuinely cannot decide, and we want to know what you think before we move on to what comes next. The weeks that followed were not a romance in the way the stories described romance. Sarah had read enough of those stories, the ones that circulated in the healing ward among the younger Omegas who loved them, and the ones she had encountered in the broader archives that documented the mate bond traditions of the packs, to know what the expected shape of this was supposed to be. There was supposed to be a dramatic reversal, a grand gesture, a moment where the alpha who had made the wrong choice made the right one in a way that was visible and sweeping and left no doubt. There were supposed to be declarations, probably with some emotional backing music if you were designing the scene, and an audience for the declarations, because the romance in those stories always had an audience. What she got instead was a series of very specific and very deliberate choices made by a man who was apparently better at sustained action than at dramatic gesture, which she found, to her ongoing mild surprise, considerably more useful. He asked for her opinion on the restructuring of the Healers Guild funding allocation, which had been a source of institutional frustration for the Guild for 6 years. He asked not in the formal way of a king consulting an advisor, but in the way of someone who understood that she had 17 years of specific expertise on the subject and wanted access to that expertise rather than a performance of it. She gave him her honest assessment, which included several things the previous administration had consistently chosen not to hear, and he took notes, and he revised the proposal twice based on her input, and the restructured allocation that went before the council, 3 weeks later, was substantially better than the one it replaced, and would materially improve the lives of approximately 300 healing practitioners across the kingdom. She sat in on 2 additional council sessions at his invitation, initially as a medical consultant on bloodline-related matters, and then, as the second session progressed, and it became apparent that her understanding of systemic institutional issues was broader than the original consultation scope, as something that the council members began directing questions to directly, a shift that happened gradually and then all at once in the way that most important shifts do. He learned her schedule. She discovered this not because he told her, but because she began noticing that the demands on her time that had previously been assigned without any attention to their conflicts with her actual work had begun to be arranged differently, the administrative requests arriving at times when she did not have patient consultations, the council invitations specifying times that the palace schedule had apparently been adjusted to accommodate rather than times that would require her to choose between them and her other responsibilities. She asked Elder Brennan about it, because Elder Brennan knew everything that happened in the palace, and was, she had determined, entirely trustworthy with information. The king reviewed the scheduling systems last week, Elder Brennan said, with the expression of a man who found this information pleasing. There were apparently a number of inefficiencies in how the medical and healing staff's time was being allocated. There have been those inefficiencies for 11 years, Sarah said. Yes, Elder Brennan agreed. There have. She did not say anything else about it to Elder Brennan, and she did not bring it up directly with Cale. But she noted it. She noted it the way she noted all the evidence she was collecting, with the precision of someone who had trained herself to see clearly, and the caution of someone who had learned that seeing clearly and understanding fully were not always the same thing. She also, in this period, began to acknowledge to herself that the mark on her neck was not the only thing connecting her to the situation. The bond was not a passive condition. It was a presence, a warmth she was learning to recognize, something that moved through her awareness in the way that background music moves through a room, not demanding attention but present at the edges of everything she did. She felt it more strongly when she was near him, which was a physiological fact and not something she had chosen, and she felt it differently than she had expected, not as a pull toward something she was resisting but as a kind of orientation, the way a compass orients, not commanding direction but indicating it. She was thinking about this one evening in the archive room, sitting with the old bloodline texts spread across the table and a lamp burning low and the castle gone quiet around her, when the door opened and Cale came in. He was not in his formal wear, which she had not seen him without before in any context she had encountered him, and the absence of the ceremonial armor and the official layers was, she found, somewhat startling. Not because it changed how she understood him, but because it added a dimension. The way a building you have only seen in formal photographs is different from the building you encounter in ordinary light. "You're working late," he said. "I find I sleep less reliably than I used to," she said. "I've been using the time productively." He came into the room, which was a different thing from standing in the doorway, and he looked at the texts spread across the table with the expression of someone who could read them, and was reading them. "The Cauldron records," he said. "The second primordial bond documentation. The most detailed one," she confirmed. The court healer who documented it was extraordinarily thorough. Her name was Marin Asheville, which suggests she was from a collateral branch of the founding line, and her records, are considerably more personal than the formal archives. She wrote about the bond development process as something she was observing, rather than just something she was recording. "What did she say about it?" he asked. And the question was genuine. The kind of question asked by someone who wants to know the answer, rather than someone who wants to know what to do with the answer. "She says it happens in layers," Sarah said. "The primordial recognition is immediate and total, because the primordial operates outside ordinary time in some sense. But the personal dimension of the bond, the part that belongs to the two people rather than to the ancient power, that develops the way trust develops, which is to say slowly, and through evidence, and through the accumulation of specific moments that each mean something individually, and together mean something else." He was quiet for a moment, and then he sat down across from her at the archive table, which was not the chair of the king in a study or the position of the alpha king at a council table, but simply a person sitting across from another person in a room full of old records. And he said, "I have been trying to give you evidence." "I know," she said. "Is it working?" he asked. And the question was so straightforwardly honest that she had to pause with it before she answered. "It's accumulating," she said finally. "Which is not nothing." "No," he agreed. "It's not nothing." They sat with the archive records between them and the low lamp burning and the castle quiet around them. And Sarah thought that this was strange and complicated, and not at all what she had expected her life to contain, and also that strange and complicated were not, in her considered experience, the same as bad. "The cauldron healer," Cale said, nodding toward the records. "Marin. What happened to her? After the documentation, after the bond completed?" Sarah turned to the final section of the records. She was appointed as the kingdom's first formal bloodline physician, a new position created specifically to account for her expertise. She sat on the predecessor to the council for 23 years. She paused. She was apparently difficult and entirely essential, and the kings who worked with her described her in terms that suggest they found her challenging and indispensable in approximately equal measure. The corner of his mouth moved. "That sounds familiar," he said. "She also," Sarah continued, looking at the record with the neutrality she was deploying somewhat strategically, wrote extensively about the mate bond in her personal correspondence, which was included in the archive donation made by her descendants. She said, and I am paraphrasing somewhat, that the bond was the most unexpected thing in a life full of unexpected things, and that she had found it was considerably easier to navigate once she stopped trying to manage it and started simply paying attention. Cale looked at her across the archive table. "Are you telling me something about yourself?" he said. "Or about Marin?" "I'm presenting documented historical information," Sarah said, "as is my professional responsibility." The corner of his mouth became an actual smile, brief and genuine, and she noted it with the same care she had been noting everything, and added it to the accumulation. "This is the moment in the story where we remind you to share it with someone who appreciates a romance that builds slowly and honestly, because those are the ones that last, and because we have a few more layers of this story to unfold, and you are not going to want to miss a single one of them." The reform of the Omega status protocols was not something that Sarah had brought to Cale directly. It was something he had brought to her, approximately 6 weeks after the council session, in the form of a question that she had not expected. He had been reviewing the guild funding restructuring's implementation, and he had noticed, or said he had noticed, though she suspected the noticing had been assisted by conversations she had not been present for, that the restructuring addressed funding inadequacies, but not the underlying structural inequalities that produced them. "Tell me about the status system," he said. They were in the study again, which had become the room they worked in together, which was not a formal designation but had simply become the case through repeated use, the way things become cases when two people are paying attention to the same problems in the same spaces. The ranking protocol that determines how omegas are categorized within the pack structure. "Tell me what it actually does." Sarah considered where to start. She had been looking at this system for 15 years, from the inside of it, from the position of someone who understood its mechanics from living within them. and she had learned that people who asked about it usually wanted a summary rather than the full account, because the full account was uncomfortable in ways that summaries could avoid. She decided to give him the full account. She talked for approximately 2 hours. She told him about the way the status ranking determined not just social position, but resource access, medical allocation, educational opportunity, and legal standing in pack disputes. She told him about the documentation procedures that required Omegas to requalify for their status rankings at intervals determined by the dominant pack members, rather than by objective criteria, which created a system of perpetual conditional standing that could be weaponized by anyone with enough social authority to call a requalification. She told him about the specific ways this had played out in the cases she had encountered across 15 years of healing work, the Omegas who had lost their status rankings during pregnancy or illness, the healers who could not access the archive records they needed for their work because their ranking did not qualify them for the relevant clearance level, the children of Omega households who entered the pack education system, already disadvantaged in ways the system described as merit-based outcomes. She also told him about herself. Not as an appeal, but as data, because it was the most detailed case she had personal access to. She had qualified for the senior Omega healer position on the basis of her competence and her examination scores and the recommendation of her predecessor, and the position had then been used by the administrative structure of the palace for 11 years as a way to access her expertise without conferring on her the status that would normally accompany that expertise, because the status system's categorization kept her in a tier where her assessments could be noted and then discounted, where her presence at council sessions was a courtesy rather than a standing, where the reform she had spent 15 years proposing through proper channels had never advanced because the people with the authority to advance it had no structural incentive to listen to someone whose standing the system itself treated as provisional. She stopped talking, and she sat in the study with the documentation in front of her, and she looked at Cale and waited. He had not looked away during any of it. He was looking at her now with an expression that she categorized, after a moment's consideration, as the face of someone doing a very specific kind of accounting, not of resources or logistics, but of something more internal. The accounting you do when you understand that you have benefited from a system that has cost someone else, and you are trying to hold that understanding without flinching away from it. I have been king for 11 years, he said. Yes, she said. This has been functioning this way for 11 years. Longer, she said. But yes, during your reign as well. I read the guild reports, he said. The annual ones. I read them. The annual reports are written by the guild administrator, who reports to the Noble Council's Oversight Committee, she said. They reflect the information that the Noble Council's Oversight Committee is comfortable receiving. I stopped submitting my full assessments to that channel 8 years ago, because the full assessments did not appear in the reports that reached the council. I have been filing the full assessments in the archive instead, in case anyone ever wanted to read the actual account. He was very still for a moment. I want to read the actual account, he said. I know, she said. That's why I told you where it was. The reform process that began from that conversation was not fast, because real reform was never fast. And anyone who said it was had either never tried to do it or had done a version of it that looked like reform and functioned like wallpaper. Sarah had no interest in wallpaper. She had 15 years of documentation and a current position that, thanks to the council resolution and the primordial mark, and the particular political moment they were in, carried considerably more weight than it had 3 months ago, and she was going to use every element of all of it with the precision she brought to everything. She worked with the council's legal team on the requalification protocols, not to eliminate ranking entirely because that was a longer project than the current political window allowed, but to establish objective rather than subjective criteria for requalification, criteria that were documented and consistent and could be appealed through a formal process that existed in the written record rather than in the discretion of whoever happened to hold social authority at a given moment. She worked with the archive administration on access protocols that linked clearance levels to documented competence rather than status ranking, which immediately resolved the situation of approximately 40 experienced practitioners across the kingdom who had been denied access to information they needed for their work for years. She presented 3 formal proposals to the council over 8 weeks, and she presented them with the documentation and the historical evidence, and the precise neutral delivery that she had learned was more effective than any appeal to fairness. Not because fairness was not a valid argument, but because institutions responded to demonstrated consequences more readily than to moral imperatives, and she had 15 years of documented consequences ready to present. Cale did something she had not asked him to do, and which she found upon observing it, that she valued considerably. He did not present the reforms as his idea. He was present at the council sessions, and he made clear in his capacity as Alpha King that the reforms had his support, which was the political weight that the proposals needed to move through the council. But he presented them as the work of the senior Omega healer, whose documentation and expertise had identified the problems and designed the solutions, which was accurate, and which was also, given the institutional dynamics of Ashvale's council, not the way that things were normally attributed. The normal way that things were attributed in council chambers was that the ideas of people without standing became the recommendations of people with standing, and the origin got compressed in the institutional record. And after enough compressions, the people who had done the actual work became invisible in the history of what had changed. He did not let that happen. He named her in the record every time, which was not a small thing, and she observed it each time with the careful attention she brought to evidence. She told him, after the 3rd council session, in the corridor that had become their regular walking route between the chamber and the study, "You didn't have to do that," with the attribution. "I am aware," he said. "It complicated the reception of the first proposal," she said. "Lord Vale was considerably less receptive than he would have been if the framing had been a royal initiative. Lord Vale came around by the end of the session," he said, "and the record is accurate. That matters more than the reception, in the long term." "You are a more interesting king than I expected," she said. "You are more than I expected," he said. And then, with the straightforward honesty that was apparently just his nature when he was not performing the public king, "I am aware that this is not adequate recompense for what I did at the recognition ceremony. I am not suggesting that it is. I'm telling you a true thing." She walked beside him and thought about truth and evidence and accumulation, and she said, "I know. I am also telling you true things. The observation about you being interesting was a true thing." He stopped in the corridor, and she stopped because she was paying attention, and he turned to look at her with the honest face and said, "Sarah." It was the first time he had used her name, not Healer Voss, not the formal address of the council chamber or the study, but her name. The way people use names when they were talking to someone rather than about them. She looked at him and let herself look, the way she had been looking at things clearly for her whole adult life. And she said, "Cale." And that was the beginning of the part that was not work. Don't even think about closing this video before the epilogue, because we promise you it is going to be worth every single second of waiting. But first, please subscribe if you haven't already, because this channel is where we tell the stories that take their time and mean it, and we want you to be here for everyone. They were bonded in the spring, in the same great hall that had witnessed the mate recognition ceremony, which was deliberate and understood to be deliberate by everyone in attendance, which was to say the entire court plus representatives from every guild in Ashvale and every pack within the Kingdom's territory, because the ceremony's scope had been Sarah's specific requirement. If it was witnessed publicly when he denied it, she had told Elder Brennan, who had looked at her with the quiet approval of a man who appreciated precision, then the correction should be witnessed publicly as well. The record should match the reality. The record matched the reality. She wore the gold that the primordial mark warranted, because it was accurate to her status and she had spent enough of her life dressing for other people's comfort. And the mark on her neck was visible above the neckline of her formal robes, and the matching resonance of the bond completion moved through every wolf in the great hall simultaneously, the way it had in the old accounts. A warmth that the witnesses would describe later as the sensation of something being finished that needed finishing. something being settled that had been unresolved in the very air of the kingdom since the night the torches went gold. And the Alpha King said the wrong thing. Elder Brennan officiated, because of course he did, because he was the person who had been present at the beginning, and he was the appropriate witness to the completion, and his expression throughout was the expression of a man who had seen enough of history to recognize when a piece of it was going particularly well. Cale looked at her the way he had been looking at her for months. The honest face. The face she had catalogued and considered and added to. The evidence, and he said the bonding words with the voice that was his voice, rather than the king's voice. And she said hers back in the same register. And the primordial deep in his bloodline made a sound that everyone in the hall felt rather than heard. A low resonance of satisfaction, of something completed, and the gold of the mark on her neck brightened for a moment, like a light turned up and then settled back to its warm, constant presence, and the court that had witnessed the beginning, witnessed the end of that particular story and the beginning of the next one. Lord Cassius Vale, to the mild surprise of several people who had observed his initial reaction to the council proceedings, was among the first to formally acknowledge her as Alpha Queen. She had not expected this, and said so, privately, to Kyle later. He told me, during the recess of the third council session, Kyle said, that he had been looking for evidence that you were pursuing the bond for advancement rather than principle, and that the Omega status reform work had persuaded him that this was not the case, because no one pursuing advancement would have invested that much work in a reform that predominantly benefits people who have no political capital to offer in return. That is a remarkably cynical compliment, Sarah said. It is, Cale agreed. But it is also completely accurate about the work. She considered this. The work is its own reason, she said. It always has been. I know, he said. That's why it persuaded him. The primordial seal, according to the monitoring she continued because she was a healer and monitoring was her nature, stabilized completely within 4 weeks of the bonding ceremony. The markers she had been tracking since the night of the blood moon returned to the baseline documented in the historical records of Dravenmore kings who had completed their bonds, and the seal's activity, which had been erratic and pressurized since the evening of the mate. Recognition settled into the low, steady hum of something functioning as designed, something that had found its anchor and was working with it rather than against it. She documented all of this in the archive, as she documented everything, with the date and the method and the interpretation, and she filed it in the section that would be most useful to any future healer who encountered a similar situation, which was the section that now bore, for the first time in the archive's history, her name, rather than someone else's summary of her work. Epilogue. 3 years later. The Healers' Academy opened on the first day of spring, in the building that had been the eastern administrative block of the palace, which had been converted through a project that had taken 14 months and considerable political navigation and the specific expertise of approximately 30 people who between them had spent the better part of centuries figuring out how to teach healing work effectively. Sarah stood at the entrance on the opening day and watched the first cohort of students arrive, 42 of them, from every status tier in Ashvale, admitted on the basis of examination scores, and demonstrated aptitude rather than pack lineage or status ranking, which was a thing that had not been true of any formal educational institution in the kingdom until now. 3 of the first cohort were from households that, under the status system that had existed before the reform, would not have qualified their members for educational clearance above the basic tier. One of them, a girl of 17 from the border territories who had passed the entrance examination with the highest score in the cohort's history, stopped at the entrance and looked at the building with an expression that Sarah recognized because she had worn it herself at 17, looking at the archive room for the first time. The expression of someone realizing that a door they had assumed was locked was, in fact, not. Cale was beside her. He had developed, over 3 years, the habit of being beside her, in the way that she had developed the habit of noticing where he was, not as a dependency, but as an orientation. The compass thing she had first identified months before the bonding. She had told him about the compass metaphor once, late in the evening in the archive room, and he had been quiet for a moment, and then said that he thought of it more as the way a ship knows it's in the right sea, which was not the same metaphor, but functioned similarly, and told her something about how he thought. She told him about the girl from the border territories later. The expression she had recognized. "What did you do when you had that expression?" he asked. "At 17, at the archive room. I went in," she said, "and I read everything." "Good," he said. "The girl did the same," she said. She was the last one to leave the entrance hall. She went straight to the medical text section. He put his hand over hers, which was a thing he did now with the ease of something that had long since stopped being deliberate and had simply become the way he moved through a room where she was. And he said, "Tell me her name." "Lyra," Sarah said. "Lyra Noss. Her mother is a border pack healer who trained without formal certification because the certification process required a status ranking her household didn't have. She told me this during the intake interview. She said her mother could have passed the examination at twice the difficulty if anyone had offered it to her." "Put that in the archive," Cale said. "Already have," she said. The mark on her neck had not faded, as the old texts had promised it would not. It was simply part of her now, the way all true things became part of a person, the way 15 years of healing work and 2 years of institutional reform, and 3 years of a bond that had begun in public humiliation and developed through documented evidence and honest conversation had become part of her, layers that she could trace if she chose to trace them, each one leading back to a specific moment, a specific choice, a specific instance of deciding to do the work rather than manage the situation. In the Healers Academy archive, which she had designed personally and which contained the most comprehensive collection of Omega status history and bloodline medicine and pack governance documentation in the kingdom's history, there was a section on the primordial mark that included her own records, alongside the ancient ones. The scholars who came after, when they wanted to understand what the mark meant and what its history was and what it had produced, would find Marin Ashvale's records and the Corvin documents and the Kessler cases and her own documentation, all of it together. The full account rather than the summary, the complete record rather than the managed version. She had made sure of it. She had made sure of it because that was the work, and the work had always been its own. Reason, and 3 years of watching what honest documentation could do for the 42 students who had walked through the academy doors that morning, had not changed her understanding of this. It had confirmed it. And in the great hall of Ashvale, in the carved galleries and along the obsidian walls, the ceremonial torches that had burned gold on the night of the mate recognition burned gold still in the records of those who had witnessed them, written into the histories that the court's grandchildren would read, the moment when the oldest power in the kingdom decided that what mattered was not what was convenient, but what was true, and marked its choice with a light that everyone present had seen, and none of them had ever found the right words for, though they had all spent a long time trying. Sarah had the right words. She had written them in the archive, in the section that bore her name. She wrote, "The bond chose correctly. The record reflects this. Let the record stand." Thank you so much for watching this story all the way to the end, which means you are exactly the kind of person this channel exists for. If this story moved you, please leave a comment below telling us which moment stayed with you the longest, because we genuinely read every single one and we want to know. Share this video with someone who loves a romance that earns every beat, and if you have not subscribed yet, please do it right now, because we have more stories like this one waiting and we want you to be here when they arrive. Until next time, take care of yourselves, and we will see you in the next story.